Welcome to Sweet Spot Safari. I'm Ben, and this is John.
Hello.
So today we'll be talking about the difference between optimism and pessimism. So why are we talking about these two themes today? Well, first of all, I think it's really important to consider these two different orientations in the world because our world is changing quite rapidly. We only have to think about the pandemic and how this has perhaps changed how we think about the future. There's also things like the climate crisis, where there has to be a balance between making the point that actually the future is uncertain, but also not taking away too much hope that actually we can do something about it. And so you'll be familiar with the term a glass half full versus half empty. And actually, this is a way that we look through certain lenses towards certain scenarios and problems. And so if you think about perhaps on the more positive side, and this really is the difference between positive and negative and how we view events. If you are an optimistically minded person, you might think on the bright side, or you might have what's called rose-tinted glasses, where actually you're looking for positivities within perhaps negative situations. And there's thinkers like Steven Pinker, for example, who famously says that existence has never been better for humans, and is very optimistic about what technology and science can do for the future. But we also just have to look at the news and have to and perhaps tune into events around the climate and our environment more broadly to actually think that actually there's a lot of pessimism about the future and about where we are currently now. And so I think the calibration between these two opposites, pessimism and optimism, can be wildly different between people and also between cultures as well. And so I think that there's probably you're familiar now that actually that this swing between feeling optimistic about the future or pessimistic about the future is quite a big gap. And so here today we're just trying to find and explore the sweet spot between these two different states of mind. So just curious, John, why are you interested in this subject?
Yes, I'm very interested in this subject, and it's a recurring theme, isn't it, Ben? When we talk together, quite often, even though we're talking about other potential polarities, this one always seems to find its way into the discussions, and that's partly to do, I think, with the political scenery that you've described. And I look at a lot of the political debate now, and it is extremely polarized in a way that people are also attaching labels to individuals. We seem to have lost the debate. And again, I know this is a topic you and I talk about a lot, is the art of debate and understanding that things can actually be separated. And that in itself, this conflation of issues and this almost tribal stance, and if you remember in the last one we talked about tribes, is generating these polarities. And I think as you get these polarities, you get levels of people who are very optimistic, partly driven by their value set as well, and people who are naturally pessimistic. But I want to pick on the other point you made about lenses. I think that is so important, right? Understanding that people do have different lenses and different approaches. And look at the climate debate. I mean, without getting into the details of the debate, that's a classic case at the moment. You've got polar people, you've got, activism at one level, and at the other end, you've got people who've been called, for instance, climate deniers and stuff, which, you could argue is quite harsh because, are they really denying climate, or do they just have a different perspective, right? Maybe you could argue, one could argue, and it's not my argument, that a so-called climate denier is actually an optimist. He believes things will sort themselves out. Where an activist, for instance, who sees it, with a different lens, a different view of the world, and sees a very pessimistic picture. And I'm only using that as an example to highlight this whole thing between optimism and pessimism. And I think, we're going to talk a bit later on about, how we can maybe try and get into a better place and look for sweet spots. But I think self-awareness is really powerful in this, understanding yourself, right? Understanding what your views, your position, is very powerful, because if you understand your position in a transparent way, you've got a greater chance of understanding the other person's position. And maybe there's good reasons that they're being pessimistic. It's situational. Remember, things are transient. We all have different levels of energy, and that's something that I'm very passionate about: understanding people's energy, and also understanding your self-awareness and what situation you're in. And that may, skew our lenses in terms of optimism and pessimism. So I think it's something, really powerful to really think about. And the more we think about ourselves and we think about others, the greater chance we are of having meaningful debate, and maybe in some way melding that optimism and pessimism and reducing the polarity of it in a way. I mean, we'll always be, optimistic, we'll always be pessimistic. That's life, but in a way that's not negatively impacting the world, our world, and the world around us. I had a personal experience back in 2018 where I was in a managerial role with a very, very tough job, given a very challenge in a very toxic environment, a very challenging environment. And, I had a choice. I could go in as a pessimist because that's all the negativity given towards me. And I probably wouldn't have come up with a solution in the end without going into detail. We got things on track, but I went in with a very optimistic approach. I used some of my coaching skills. I looked at things with different lenses, and not only did I look at things with different lenses, I was managed to influence people in a way that they could see things with a different lens. And I think when you do see these other lenses, all of a sudden the world changes, right? So I think it's a very complex issue. Two, it's very nuanced. But I think if we can get to this point where we can have this more transparent view, open-minded, using different lenses, I think we've got an opportunity. And why wouldn't the world benefit from that? Given the parlor state, you talked about COVID and the war and all this sort of stuff that the world's in at the moment. So I think, it's very important. That doesn't mean, by the way, we have false positivity, because false positivity and over optimism can lead to all sorts of problems. We'll touch on that a bit later on. So does that make sense, Ben?
Yeah, it does, and I think I'll pick up on the last point which you made and connecting it back to politics and politics and perhaps misplaced optimism. And I think that we're looking for optimism because actually optimism gives us hope, but we've also got senses when we actually know that optimism is misplaced. And perhaps looking at our recent leadership, where Liz Truss had a very short tenure. And maybe in part that was because she was trying to evoke this optimism about economic growth, which perhaps was misplaced, because for X number of years since the financial crash, we just haven't had 2.5% economic growth, and actually it didn't feel like the conditions were there for what she was trying to sell to the public and the markets. And so I think actually just having this realistic sense of optimism, I think, is incredibly important. And you just briefly touched on energy as well there, John, because I think that for me, if I kind of go into a workplace culture, or perhaps I'm in an online environment, actually, if there's lots of pessimism within these environments, actually it can drain quite a lot of our energy. So actually optimism is, for me, quite an important driver of energy, of motivation to learn, to grow. And so actually for me, it's just, it's incredibly important. But it's also important that it isn't misplaced or kind of perhaps delusionally optimistic. So yeah, I think great points. And I kind of think now about where I am, and there's certainly some things which I'm hopeful about, but there's also some things which I'm less hopeful about. And I think maybe one of the more hopeful changes which I can see is that for the last X number of decades, we've basically been creating this globalized world. But actually, I do think what's happened with perhaps the pandemic and recognizing the fragility of supply chains, there's more of a focus in rebuilding from local community roots. And so actually something which I am optimistic about is that perhaps in the future we're going to become a little bit more kind of local. which I think gives me a sense of like rebuilding relationships, rebuilding means of production, rebuilding community infrastructure, social capital. That gives me hope. I think things which perhaps give me less hope, that maybe our kind of political systems, maybe our social media environments. I'm less hopeful about seeing positive outcomes from those in the near term. I feel that our politics will perhaps become a bit more fractured, and our online discourse will consequently also become quite polarized. So I'm less hopeful about that. And then in respect to our environment, I'm not incredibly hopeful about finding a way to solve some of our environmental challenges, because basically it requires global cooperation, and it doesn't feel like we're actually in a position now to cooperate. In fact, we're having wars, and actually conflict is more likely than cooperation. So there's some things which I'm hopeful about, and some things which I'm less hopeful about. I don't know if you've got any views on any of those, and what perhaps your versions are.
Yeah, I think I can absolutely see where you're coming from, and the truth is, I'm not so sure whether I'm an optimist or a pessimist at the moment. I'll be honest. I'm sure. I think I'm unsure. I think it depends on the situation, and we've talked about context and nuance before, and what lens I'm wearing at the time. I have different views, and more optimistic views on certain things, possibly about the war, and possibly more pessimistic views about the environment. But I also, with my engineering background, believe that there's also cause and effect, and I think that if we're going to, I totally agree, we need global collaboration if we're going to solve the problem. But then the question is, how do we get that global collaboration? What's the trigger? How do we get to that point where we start collaborating more? Is it the burning platform of the environment? Excuse the pun, for instance. Is that what's going to drive global collaboration, or can we influence things a bit more by breaking things down? I'm always very mindful, as I said, as before, my historical engineering roots is, when we tackle large problems, we always break them down. As the old argument, in order to eat the elephant, you break it down into elephant steaks. And I wonder whether, because this whole geopolitical situation is very emotionally charged, we've talked about tribalism, is that is masking our abilities, our cognitive side, our abilities to think critically, and whereby some of these problems that we could tackle, we'd be able to tackle them better if we had more cognition, and we were able to think about things, look at things in a different way, and break them down. I think, certainly with the war, for instance, I think there's opportunities there with some thinking, right, that we can actually solve that problem. And maybe solving the war, for instance, helps us solving the environment, because of course the war in itself is an environmental disaster. So I think there's definitely things that I think we can do, and I think the more dialogue that we have around these, the more open dialogue that we have, the more chance we've got to find in that sweet spot we talked about. And I'm a big believer in transparency. I think when people work in the shadows, I think that's what we've got a problem. And it was interesting when you talked earlier about your pessimism associated with social media. I tend to hold that view as well. And I think the problem with social media is that at one level, it looks very open and transparent. That's the window you see. But, we've seen all the situations with the trolling cultures and cancel cultures, and people being, I'm trying to think of the right wording here. Attacked is probably the word, whatever you'd like to call it, intellectually attacked, verbally attacked, whatever, in the shadows. I think that's a huge problem, because, people are getting bandwidth and, a level of collection, but not transparently. And it's the old story. If you see it, you can deal with it. If you can't see it, you can't deal with it. So I do think there are some challenges with social media, and I think it's incumbent on those owners of social media, the technocrats, shall we say, need to do something about the transparency. I know there's a huge groundswell of opinion, and I'm not, I don't want to hold out any individuals specifically, but I saw an interesting post the other day about we're being in the area of, techno feudalism. It was quite funny. There was a picture of Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Jeff Bezos in Elizabethan costumes, and were trying to compare them to the barons of the Middle Ages that we had in the UK, where they had the land, and because they had the land, they controlled the taxes and they controlled everything. There's an argument to say that these three individuals and others have an over influence, because they control the data. I heard a great expression the other year. It was, unless you own the data, you are the data. And that really made me think about where we are. So I think there are reasons to be, pessimistic, shall we say, about social media and that stuff. But there's also reasons to optimism, in having some faith in humankind and optimism. Because I see, for instance, if you look at Facebook, their share capital is tanking at the moment, right? People are moving more and more away from it because maybe it's not transparent enough. Maybe they've got issues with the way it's been, manipulated, arguably, in the algorithms, and we had the whole issue with Cambridge Analytica a few years ago and the elections and everything else. So I think, there's all sorts of things going on. But I think just to sort of wrap this up a bit, and again, I do think we need more critical thinking and being able to see things for what they are, right? Margaret Heffernan, I was lucky to meet her online last year, and she's written some wonderful books, but the one that resonates with me most is a thing called Willful Blindness. And it's all about cognitive dissonance. It's about people can see things in front of them and their brains know that there's a problem, but they don't do anything about it. They choose not to do something about it because either their emotions take over, which is a bit like Daniel Kahneman's, type 1 brain, or for whatever reasons in terms of gain or their own value set, they choose not to do them. And she cites some very interesting examples with some of the disasters, some of the environmental disasters, BP and Texas City, which is close to me being a chemical engineer, and Macondo well. And it's interesting to break these down. But I do think we are living in a world of cognitive dissonance. And interesting enough, although I don't watch the news so much this morning, there was a debate about energy crisis this morning, and one commentator was saying is we seem to be got totally optimistic, that we should actually be doing more, and it's not right that we should be having the Christmas lights on when we're short of energy. We should be doing a lot more about it, and people just almost in that sort of state of suspended animation where it'll be all right on the night, we can still burn energy and it's going to be fine. I'm not sure I totally hold that view. I think there's a balance point again between shutting things down to save energy and giving some people some level of hope. So again, it's a very complex issue. So those are my reflections, Ben. I don't know whether it resonates.
Yeah, they're great, John. I guess one frame or one thing that springs to mind about what you've just said is that the techno-feudalism point, I think, or observation is a really good one. And before that, I was thinking, should we look to billionaires and these tech companies and maybe our politicians for this change, or does this change come from your point about having faith in humankind, in ordinary people doing different things day to day? And the crisis of the pandemic, in some ways basically pushed people into more isolated, self-sufficient lives, but it also did the opposite, where a lot of mutual aid and community regeneration projects happened, where people came together and solved local problems. And so what crises seem to do is almost create opposing opposing processes. Some, to me, from my point of view, some are definitely positive and some are very much negative. And yeah, so I just wonder whether this change is going to predominantly come from global leaders deciding that actually action definitely needs to be taken for the positive, for the good of all humans, or whether it's actually just ordinary humans changing their choices day to day, changing their interactions, changing what they value, which is really going to drive the change, or whether it's just a combination of both. And you can't separate them out. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on where that change.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Ben. I think you posed a really interesting question, and I've been thinking about it as you've been talking, and I've been thinking, well, is it the people collectively, wanting change and trying to solve the problem, or is it global leaders and billionaires, as you described,
Mm.
them getting together and saying, look, we need to do some change? I'm not sure which way it work. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but what I do think, and again, quite often when we have these discussions, we talk about process and the power of process and the power of context. I think certainly if it was down to the leaders, this small number of very, very influential leaders around the world. I mean, they're not the only ones. There are leaders in countries very wealthy countries who've got influence as well. Is they need to be transparent. And I keep coming back to this point. I think the more transparent they are, then the more chance they will of having influence. Because if they're not transparent, then people won't trust them, right? And then we're going to have more conflict, right? Because if in the world, I want to do good, for all the right reasons, not only do I need to say I want to do good, but actions speak louder as well. People have to be seen, to be doing the right thing. So, if I'm a philanthropist, right, it's not just about me saying I'm a philanthropist and throwing money at it. It's like, this is what I'm doing. This is where my skin is in the game. And Nassim Taleb talks about that in his wonderful book, Skin in the Game. The difference between, people who've got some real collateral, right, and they're prepared to put themselves at risk, right, for the greater good or for negotiation or whatever context, versus people who have no skin in the game. There is no collateral and stuff. And so, it's the old business of role modeling behavior, seeing is believing and believing is seeing. So I'm not so sure whether that answers the question. I mean, my view is I really don't know, but I do have faith in humankind, and I do have faith in the right processes and collaboration and stuff. I mean, I happen to be a more glasses overall half full person, right? That's how I've lived my life, rather than the glasses half empty person. But that doesn't mean that I'm not pessimistic about other things. It also means I'm not a realist either. I'm a combination of both. I think it depends on the situation. And if I look at my own career, and I'd be interested to hear about your life experiences in a minute as well, Ben. If I look at my own career, it has gone, fortunate for me, I've been very lucky that it's gone way beyond my initial expectations. Now, why did that happen? That's probably because I was a glasses half full person. Because if I'd been pessimistic, I probably wouldn't have taken the challenges or the risks in my career that allowed me to move on. I'm always, constantly pushing my own personal boundaries. And when I reflect back on my career, that has served me well. I've got way beyond than I ever thought that I would do. And that's not being necessarily down to my skills and experience. I think a lot of it was down to my drive and my motivation and pushing my boundaries and taking a level of personal risk. So I think that links into that to a certain extent. And I think, I'd like to come on in a minute in your life experiences as well, Ben, because I know you've had a very rich life too. I think it's worthwhile just let's calibrate on the definitions of optimism. So if there are plenty of dictionary definitions of optimism, but the one that I personally like is that optimism is a belief that a change is inevitable, but good will come from that change, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas you could argue pessimism is the opposite of that. And I think the danger of pessimism, of course, which you alluded to at the head of the conversation, is that it can lead to a sort of a doom loop or a negative spiral. But I do believe, first of all, you understand that change is inevitable, in a rapidly changing world. But you believe that the change will be for the good, right? So that, to me, is a really powerful definition of optimism. But I'd like to, hear some of your life experiences and how they relate to this conversation, Ben.
Yeah, I think reflecting back on my own life experiences, it probably mirrors a lot of what you've just said, in that you're a combination of both an optimist and a pessimist. And I feel that my life just hasn't really been a straight line, where it feels like there's been quite a lot of highs, quite a lot of lows, and obviously these natural patterns and cycles do change your orientation. They do change. Every experience shapes how you think and how you orientate in the world, and that's my perception. And I think that in general, I grew up, although I grew up in perhaps a slightly rough neighborhood, had a few family difficulties, a few mental health challenges in my family. I was generally a happy, optimistic kid. And then kind of growing up in the 90s, I felt like the 90s, I was quite fortunate. If I compare it to a teenager growing up now, with all of the challenges which we talk about, everything from mental health to the climate to wars to energy problems to debt, the list goes on. I feel like I didn't have that in the 90s. So I felt like maybe the 90s politically and globally was actually pretty stable. And so I sense I grew up in a culture where it was reasonably optimistic. We didn't have too many things to think about. So I was definitely grateful for that. I think it was for me, school put me off learning. So that in some ways that made me quite pessimistic about education, and it's the reason why I'm interested in reforming or reimagining education now, because I think that the way that we teach, the education system, the kind of academia, I think a lot of our problems could be framed, if you like, as problems of education. The education system creates our society, it creates our politics, it creates our economics, it creates the human beings which populate society. So I think in many ways a hope for me has been around the idea of reimagining education. And I think just different industries I've worked in, I've definitely felt a sense of optimism or pessimism. I think working in financial services, or certainly in insurance, I felt perhaps I had a slightly more pessimistic outlook on kind of my career and that particular industry. But then working in media and advertising and digital technology, that perhaps was a little bit more optimistic about change and about the future, because actually it felt like things were actually changing quite rapidly. So different stages, different career paths, different times in my life, I felt like I oscillated between optimism and pessimism. And yeah, even just going back a few years ago when I got diagnosed with ADHD, my mental health deteriorated temporarily. And typically when it deteriorates, you go into a more pessimistic, more kind of melancholy, flavor of being in the world. So I feel just fortunate that actually I've had periods of having a lot of optimism, but also having quite significant pessimism. But for me, the sense of feeling optimistic just is a lot more energizing. And actually that's just an energy is a big thing for me. And so actually, if I can wake up feeling optimistic every morning, or at least hopeful that actually I can make a difference, and the world will still be here in the future, that's that's a good head start. So they're kind of my reflections really on just looking back.
No, it's really powerful. And I think there's a couple of points I'd like to come back on you and ask you some deeper reflections, if that's okay, Ben.
Yeah, sure.
First of all, I think on the energy thing, I mentioned earlier, it's a big thing for me too. I think that's where we definitely overlap. And in fact, one of the things that actually I've been trained in is a thing called energy leadership. I may have mentioned it before, but it's about how our personal resonating levels of energy can change, and it has a direct impact on our performance. You could argue our levels of optimism and pessimism, depending on the context. And that is situational, right? It's what the situation you're in, a bit like your situation about being diagnosed with ADHD. And it's also down to your personal self-awareness. And the beauty about personal self-awareness is the more self-aware you are, and I firmly believe in, the better you are to cope with these situations. But what I'd like to come back onto is a couple of things. First of all, when you talked about education and being sort of disrupted or not in the right way, not serving people, was probably a better expression. Can I ask you, is that because you think the education, I'm going to come back on another point in a minute, is the education system is too linear, or am I putting words into your mouth here?
Well, in part, we, the way I see diversity is I see diversity as very holistic. We have a tendency to think about diversity through this very narrow, categorical, lens, but actually, humans are just inherently diverse on so many different levels. Yet we've created a standardized education system, which is the opposite to diversity. So what we're doing is we're saying that, irrespective of your diversity, and I mean kind of viewpoints, cognitive styles, learning styles, communication styles, all of the different experiences that perhaps you bring to the classroom, what we're going to do is just basically funnel it into a one-size-fits-all approach to learning. And and I just don't think that serves anybody. And
really, what you're saying is that is creating artificial boundaries for neurodiverse people.
Well, just so many different, kind of culturally diverse people, or even if you don't label yourself as neurodiverse, that I think basically what it is it kind of feels a bit like a game, if I'm honest. That actually, if you can learn the rules of the game, you can basically gain the kind of the exam process, or the kind of the kind of system as a whole. And I don't think that even does justice to the people that are able to game well. I think we're kind of all losing if we zoom out far enough, with the way that we do education. And I think that education is both linear. I think it's just an amalgamation of just randomly assorted parts, which doesn't come together in a coherent whole to help an individual basically live a fulfilling life. And I think there's multiple issues with it. I don't think it should be a training system for the economy, for the market. I think education should be broader and deeper than that. I don't think it. You mentioned earlier on about in a conversation before this about emotions. And a lot of our challenges, perhaps in the workplace and in society, can be seen through an emotional regulation lens. But at no point in education do we talked about emotional intelligence and how to think about emotions, how to build both emotional intelligence, social intelligence, different types of intelligence, rather than this very kind of narrow, cognitive only in intelligence. And it's basically regurgitating of facts. So for me, just that feels very in line with the old industrial society that we have or had, and very out of step with the future that we want to create, or the problems which we have to contend with right now. So that there are a few points, and it just that kind of that makes me quite pessimistic, but then quite optimistic that actually reforming education is going to be a really big part of the future of society.
So I'd like to come back on that and the other point, if that's okay. So I'm hold the thought about the education, because I'm going to come on to that one. And my earlier point, you talked about growing up in the 80s and the 90s where things were relatively simple, and it was an optimistic time. I know, economically there was a lot of growth as well, and people's personal wealth, etc., was growing quite well. I grew up in the late 60s and the early 70s, touched on the 80s as well. And the one thing that I reflect in some of the commentators is that it was a more carefree time because we had less choice, right? And arguably having less choice, right, removes some of the stress, because you basically have minimal options, so you're not worried about making choice. And when you look at the youth of the day and some of the problems that they face, I'm lucky enough to have children. One of them has just started a medically based degree, and another one who's just finished university and started a job. And I've been chatting to both of them. Both of them have got situations with lots of choice, right, and lots of stress associated with that choice. And so I think that is a really big point around. And sometimes you can have too much choice. And having spoken to some of the younger generations, that's some of the conversations that I've had. So I think you make a valid point. I think coming back onto questioning the education. Now the dog has got quiet, by the way.
Is that the postman?
So the postman must have arrived. So there's some hope for me yet. There might be
Yeah.
some post there. It's going on to your point about education. I think you're right. What I do see is some hope, because I do see the curricula changing. If I going back to my education, which was very linear, very, as you say, predetermined for the industrial economic world, I benefited certain things of that age, but I missed loads of stuff right around the emotional intelligence. If I look at the modules that my son and daughter were doing at university, there's a lot more around that than there ever was before. So I think that's my hope. I think curricula is changing for the better, and people are getting opportunities to do things. And a good example of those is my daughter. And we're having a really powerful discussion the other week. One of her modules involves looking at personality, looking at the 16 personality types and factors and MBTI, and we had a great discussion about that. I was having a dialogue this morning with a colleague in the Middle East about personality types and how that's going to affect our interaction, how we manage a project. So I think that it is there. I think the curriculum is changing for the good, but again, I think we get back to this point of balance again. It's about finding the balance, isn't it, between emotional intelligence and the cognitive side of things to get us in the right space. Everywhere there is a balance, I believe, anyway. So I think I am quite hopeful around the education system. And when I look at my coaching world, when I look at some of the young people coming through the coaching, they are way more capable in a lot of areas than I ever was, because they've had this expanding curricula. So I do have a lot of hope in the world. So I think, at that point, Ben, I'm going to, again, come back to you again and think about, we've talked about sweet spots, in our introductions, and we talked about it in our previous dialogues. What do you see? Where do you see the opportunities? Where do you see the hope for sweet spots based on what you're seeing right now?
Well, I think one of the dangers that we have when we try and systematize ideas, we tend to kind of overreact sometimes. And I think we're going through this in some ways quite pessimistic phase. And sometimes we have a tendency to kind of overcorrect in different directions. And the idea with Sweet Spot Safari is just trying to navigate that middle ground and actually seeing the value of opposites and different opposing forces. And so I think, first of all, recognizing that both optimism and pessimism are traits of humans, because they've basically been evolutionarily adaptive in the past. So the reason why we have them is because actually they've helped us survive. And so first of all, just actually recognizing that although we might gravitate towards perhaps more optimistic leaders and environments, actually reminding ourselves that actually pessimism does actually have a value there for us. And you talk about oscillating between both, and I think I do as well. So maybe with pessimism, one example that springs to mind is something called the pre-mortem, which has become popularized in workplaces relating to project management and kind of innovation in the workplace. And so the idea really behind, you'll be familiar with post-mortem, and we kind of think of post-mortems as autopsies on.
I've actually done some pre-mortems on projects. It's there to mitigate risk and be more efficient in the process. Yeah.
So I think the idea is actually, well, can we engage that catastrophe thinking mind or that pessimistic mind and actually thinking about a project in the future that actually it's just been an utter failure? Because if we just always start projects in the workplace with an expectation that they will succeed, which we quite often do, we won't be prepared for failure. And so kind of pre-mortem is really a tool for exploring everything that can go wrong. And then working back from that. And so I think in some ways it's, the Stoics, who a lot of people will be familiar with, and actually the Stoic philosophy, kind of weaves through a lot of Silicon Valley, which is a kind of way of actually having an optimistic outlook despite adversity. But also what they do, they're very good at also thinking about catastrophes or kind of problems, and imagining and basically preparing for problems which perhaps haven't happened, but actually when we get around to actually experiencing that problem, we're kind of already prepared. And so maybe kind of one frame or kind of one analogy is actually seeing that the grey clouds have silver linings. And so, there's not always purely negative in a negative situation. There is some positive frames as well. What about you? Is there anything which springs to mind?
Yeah, I'd like to build on the concept of the pre-mortem. I think that's extremely powerful, and I think the thing is to make sure that it doesn't have negative connotations. See it as a positive thing, right? Again, there's a level of precognition around a project or an initiative or something that helps you making silly mistakes. If we look at the current political situation, we've been through a lot of political turmoil in the UK. Maybe a few pre-mortems on some of the things that be going on there might have at least mitigated some risks in the economy and other things as well. But without dwelling on that, I know I have absolute personal experience of it. As a chemical engineer, we're dealing with very complex chemical processes, potentially very dangerous large-scale chemical processes, which have the potential to either harm or maim. And one of the things that we do in that area is a process hazard analysis, which is effectively a pre-mortem, right? And one of the techniques is what if, right, with checklists, right, where you go, what if this happened? What if that happened? Can we deal with it? And that basically mitigates a lot of risk. And I've looked, I'm trying to, bring some to mind, but I've looked at a lot of recent projects or, government initiatives or things that are in the public domain, not even necessarily government-led. And I really do think sometimes, if they, who did the what if analysis? When you definitely, who actually sat down and thought about this, before they've done it? You look at the whole move towards digitization at the moment. We're now dealing with chat bots and chat rooms, and we're getting rid of telephone lines, and we've cut down on the number of staff so they can't cope with the number of email. But who's actually thinking about the out of the ordinary situations? The people who are, and particularly with age, I don't want to get into age discrimination, but when we've got generations who are not technically enabled or capable as other people, how is my mother going to deal with a chatbot, for instance? Are we going to exclude that whole level of society? I don't know, but to me, if somebody had actually done a what if scenario on that, pre-mortem maybe, then it would be a different space. I mean, there are leading examples. I've dealt with, I won't mention any names, but I've dealt on the phone with a supplier quite recently, a well-known global supplier, and their customer service and their responsiveness was superb. They don't deal with chatbots, right? They've got the staff there to do it. So that means anybody in that range, right, can solve a problem, and they're absolutely excellent. And I think, the hope part there is that I think there's huge opportunity for the companies that do the right thing, right? And I'm just using that as an example, is they will be seen as shining lights, and then people will start to resonate. They're transparent, right? It's out, it's on their website. What they do is transparent. So I keep coming back without trying to overemphasize it. I think, in order to be hopeful, we need to have trust. And one of the models that we use in my business, we have our own trust model, and we analogize it like a three-legged stool. If you can imagine, trust is the base of the stool. That's the thing you actually sit on. Imagine a three-legged milking stool. The legs are, authenticity, consistency, and transparency, all of which you have to build trust. Trust takes time to build. If you take one of those legs away, right, the stool will fall over very, very quickly. So I think, to me, the sweet spot or potential sweet spot here is building a culture of trust. A lot of people talk about it, but people don't necessarily understand it, right? What is trust founded on? Well, it's founded on being totally authentic all the time, being consistent in what you do, and being transparent. I think if you can, for me personally, if we can get to a world where we talked about global leaders earlier on, collaborating. Well, in order to collaborate, they have to trust each other. Well, in order to trust each other, you need to be authentic, consistent, and transparent, and that's the challenge. The challenge for me is, to generate this optimism, is to get people into that space. If that makes sense, Ben, so that's just sort of my final sort of
Mm.
reflection, I think, on today's discussions in terms of where I think we go. I'm not here to solve the problem, right? I'm here to try and help people, process the thinking.
Mm.
And I just want, before we come in with your final reflections, Ben, I think just one final quote from the founder of my coaching school, IPEC in America, a guy called Dr. Bruce Snyder, who's a psychologist. And he has this mantra that says, raising the consciousness of the world one by one. And I think
Mm.
what he means by that is, and it's something that you and I have touched on, is every time we meet somebody, we have a positive conversation, with hope, right? And optimism,
Mm.
then you've got to, that will hopefully transform their lives and they will have a more hopeful dialogue or a more optimistic conversation with everybody else. Because I don't believe there's going to be any, dare I say, for want of a better word, mass indoctrination of people in terms of changing like that. I think it's down to humans, right? Having positive relationships with other humans, a bit like the localization and the ecology you talked about, and the social ecosystem. So I think gradually building these social ecosystems is the way forward. Of course, the challenge is always a lot of people will say, is that going to happen fast enough? With big issues like war and climate change, and I really don't know that, but I think you have to have belief, and that's the optimism in me, if that makes sense. So that's really my final reflections today.
Yeah.
So over to you, Ben.
Yeah. Thanks, John. And I think how far, how fast. Yeah, it's again, it's a matter of perspective, and we don't know because there's so many complex parts. We will never be able to know whether we should be doing more, we should be going quicker. It's very difficult to gauge. But I guess just to close out, just a few frames to think about sweet spots for the listeners. So there's one which is called realistic optimism, which I think was somebody called Tony Schwartz who came up with the term, and it's basically seeing the world as it is, but having a bias towards action in changing it. Another kind of frame perhaps associated with this is maybe hoping, trying to get better as leaders and as individuals, as hoping for the best, but also planning for the worst at the same time. So it's not really just, as I say, just focusing on optimism and shutting your pessimism down. It's actually doing something with that pessimism. And I think that phrase sums it up. And so we might perhaps do that, as part of a problem-solving mindset where we see problems and reframe them into opportunities. I think we kind of do that quite a lot, in our own lives and in work in general. And then I think thinking about the future, arts, whether it's music, whether it's movies, whether it's books, novels, they help us bring this optimism or pessimism, into our lives, into culture, and kind of one contrast which you might want to think about is you draw more towards dystopia or utopia futures, and we kind of got a lot of those either or types of movies, types of novels going on at the moment. But there's also a term by Kevin Kelly called protopia, which is that sweet spot in the middle, that actually maybe this extreme change towards the future is unrealistic, and actually societies and cultures evolve just by continuously iterating and getting better at solving problems bit by bit. And so maybe kind of the aim of protopia is probably more realistic than imagining a future which is completely dystopic or kind of utopic. And so I think that one final reflection is maybe kind of approaching challenges with a pessimistic intellect, which means that actually there's kind of more complexity to our problems than perhaps we realize, but having an optimistic will, which is our intention to actually go about trying to make changes, I think is a useful sweet spot there. I think that kind of captures this conversation and wraps up. So hopefully it's been useful. But that's all from us now.
No, that's great, actually. And just as we sign off, I think just picking up on your last point there, so I think what you're saying is, I love the concept of protopia, by the way. I think it also ties in with the concept of multiple small changes, which I believe, eating the elephant, etc. But also, I think what we're saying is, I think that both pessimism and optimism both have a place, right? And I like the idea of intellectual pessimism, so they can coexist. So I think on that point, I think we'll leave it there for today. And thanks again, Ben, for being with us today. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and look forward to our next topic, and see us on YouTube. Thank you again for listening.
Likewise. Take care.